here. Delighted to have with us Saifullah Hajimuftuoğlu, the Secretary General of the National Security Council of the Republic of Turkey, Rich Outzen, the former ambassador to the US Secretary of State, former advisor rather, let me correct that, Professor Dr. Murad Yeşiltaş, the SETA Security Studies Director, Muhammad Hanif Atmar, the Foreign Minister of Afghanistan, Hassoumi Masmoudou, the Minister of State and Foreign Minister of Niger, and Mohamed Musa Bello, Minister of the Federal Capital of Nigeria. As you can tell, it's no accident that we have such a wide selection of guests, statesmen, top diplomats, and experts from the countries represented up here on the stage. I think it's fair to say that each of them have an experience in dealing with the problem of terrorism within their own spheres of influence and countries. I want to start by telling a story. It's good to tell a story sometimes. It's after lunch, right? But it is a true story. You will recall, no doubt, that at the end of the Trump administration, there was a move by the then US president to designate a certain group in Yemen, informally known as the Houthis, also referred to as Ansarullah, as a terrorist organization. And we may all remember what happened when that declaration was made. There was an outpouring of objections from different quarters, but particularly from aid agencies. They were concerned about what the designation of this group as a terrorist organization would mean for the delivery of aid into the country. If you consider a group terrorist, it's difficult to have contacts and dealings with them, right? So then our story progresses and elections come and we have a new US administration, the Joe Biden administration, and they decide to reverse that designation in order for the aid process to pick up. But then there's another wave of objections from another group or parties who see the unbranding of the Houthis as a terrorist organization as now a threat to their interests and, in their narrative, to global security as well. And I think the moral of this story is really how complicated this issue is, starting from the very basics, the very basic issue of just defining who's the terrorist and how do you deal with them. So now, having set the ground and the stage for us to hopefully solve that problem here today, I think it's going to be time for us to get straight into questions. Before I do that, though, let me just remind everybody that at the end we will make time available for questions and answers, and I want to encourage the audience to please come forward with your questions. Don't hold back. We like it when there's a dialogue going. You can only have a dialogue when you've got people joining the discussion from the floor as well, right? So let me pose perhaps the natural first question flowing on from the point I've made. Can terrorism really be defeated without a common position on defining what is terrorism? Can I perhaps pose that question to Saifullah Hajimuftuoğlu? I think we need just to press the button. We're still having microphone issues. Sorry. Affedersiniz beyefendi. All right.
Çok teşekkür ederim. Bu kadar seskin zevat içinde dünyanın belki en zor meselesini konuşmak benim için de bir şans. Bu şansı veren arkadaşlarımıza fazlasıyla müteşekkirim. Terör çözülebilir mi? Soru o. Bir terörü tanımlayabilip bir çözüm üretebilir miyiz? Eğer çok net ve çabuk söyleyeceğim, eğer bütün dünya terörle mücadele konusunda samimi olursak ve bu samimiyet üzerine oluşturacağımız ilişkileri pratiğe dökebilirsek terörü çözmemek için hiçbir sebep yok. Burada esas olan samimiyettir. Samimiyetin de birinci kısmı zenginliği paylaşmak. Ben bu yıl 60. yaşındayım. Aşağı yukarı 40 yılım. Bu konuda okumalarla, çalışmalarla yaptığım tüm iş bu konuyu anlayabilmek, kavrayabilmek ve profesyonelce yönetebilmek. Söyleyeceğim şey, zenginliği paylaşmamız gerekiyor. Terörizmin temeli kesinlikle kendiliğinden oluşan bir şey değildir. Ya adaletsizliğe itirazdır, ya da zenginliğinin kaybolmasını görünce yine orada da bir adaletsizlik var. Ona yapılan itirazdır. Bizim samimiyetle zenginliği paylaşma konusunda ittifak etmemiz ve ona göre organize olmamız lazım. Birinci kısım bu. İkinci kısım terörle mücadelede samimi olmaktır. Kesinlikle terörle mücadelede samimiyet. Bu bir terör örgütünün birisi için kıymetli, bir başkası için kıymetsiz. Böyle bir şey yok. Terör terördür, terörist teröristtir. Grup da bütün insanlığı karşısına alan bir yapıdır. Dolayısıyla eğer mücadeleyi gerçekten yapma niyetindeysek burada samimi olmamız lazım. Mesela yani en net örnek bu konuda hiçbir terör örgütünün mühimmat fabrikası yoktur. Hiçbir terör örgütünün silah fabrikası yoktur. Ama bunları bulabiliyor. Nereden bulduğunu oturup bütün dünyanın samimi bir şekilde konuşması.
Saifullah, isn't the obvious answer that terrorism is armed, is financed by states which are not happy with each other to a certain extent? It's often a tool, right? I mean, let's have a frank discussion.
Öyle
Like you said, they don't have their own factories making weapons, so somebody's giving it to them. Somebody's at the very least turning a blind eye on the black market.
Tam da burada samimiyet esastır. Samimi olmamız lazım. Hiç kimsenin yoksa o zaman samimi bir şekilde nereden temin ettiğine, kimin ürettiğine bakmamız lazım. Buna baktığımızda ve samimi bir şekilde çözüm ürettiğimizde aslında terörizm kalmaz. Ancak zenginliği de paylaşmak gerekiyor. Bir yer fazlasıyla zenginleşirse başka bir yerin oraya heves duyup gitmemesi mümkün değil. Gittiğinde adaptasyon problemleri oluyor. Onlar da beraberinde terörizmi getiriyor. Ben birinci soruda bu cevapla tamamlayayım diyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
Okay, I think this is a good point to now try and segue Rich into the discussion. Rich, if you allow me, probably an area you don't want to dive into at this point, but you will no doubt recall the statement when U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter made before the Congress in 2016 when he was asked, I think it was by Lindsey Graham at the time, about whether the YPG and PYD are linked to the PKK, and he said, well, yes, they are. And then the discussion naturally developed, as you would expect it to do in Congress. Well, okay, so why are we supporting the YPD and the PYD and the YPG if they are linked to a group, the PKK, that we as in America consider to be a terrorist group? This sort of level of discussion, does it not highlight exactly the point which we're getting into, which is, can the policy towards terrorism, is it too idealistic to expect it's really going to be based simply on morals and ethics, or is it always going to be trumped by political expediency at the end of the day, or what one state or another? And it's not just the US, I mean, there are allegations about every country's got allegations for the other one, almost in supporting in one form or another some group that somebody considers terrorism, right? So is there a way out of this?
Well, it's an important point you raise. First, let me just say thank you again to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and my dear friend, Deputy Minister Sadat Onal, and the rest of the hosts of this wonderful event. And it's an especial honor to be with these distinguished panelists and Minister Atmar, who I believe when I served in Afghanistan, I may have met a time or two. Deeply honored to be here again on the stage with you. So without turning this into an analysis of a specific policy, let's talk about the definitional issue, because something happened at the beginning of the 21st century. Terrorism adapted. Terrorism adapted to a number of changes in technology, and what we saw is simple terror groups that we might have seen in the 1970s or the 1980s that focused on bombings and kidnappings, all of a sudden became almost quasi-states in some regards. And I have to disagree that there's always a state behind it, because when states collapse or when states are weak, quasi-states emerge. A great example of this is Hezbollah in Lebanon. With the fracturing of the Lebanese state, we saw Hezbollah arrogate to itself tremendous power over the economy. And by the way, our Iranian friends have fostered this sort of thing among the Houthis, who we talked about earlier, in Yemen as well. So the growth of quasi-states that seize some of the productive capacity of a territory and organize the people in some way and exert coercive power over them.
But then, Rich, wouldn't it be fair to say, even in that situation where a vacuum is created, and yes, it might be filled by a non-state actor, but with backing somehow from another state entity, right?
I think empirically that is usually the case. You can usually find the fingerprints of a state that is financing or supplying weapons or otherwise helping terror. And I think you're right. Oftentimes it's because states are using this as what the Turks might call vekalet savaşı, right? A sort of a proxy warfare. And that's one of the points I really wanted to make here, is that we collectively have a definitional problem, because it's not just that the terrorists have adjusted what sort of activities they do. Now they're running narcotics, there's cyber terrorism, there's all sorts of things that have clouded what it is that these terror groups are doing, and they're exercising quasi-state-like authority. It's a very broad definition now of what a terror group can do. But the broader that definition is taken, the harder cooperation across national lines becomes. It's actually a very smart adaptation. So we have to focus on each type of activity, I think, and come up with aggressive steps against it. Now, to address a little bit the specific question you asked about the YPG, I think it is a peculiarity of the U.S. Foreign policy making, or perhaps not a peculiarity, but something we share with some other states as well, that it does not always do a deep contextual research when it takes a reactive step. Our reactive step in 2013 and 2014, after the fall of Mosul to ISIS, and when Syria was bursting into the full flames of a horrible humanitarian situation, a very narrow definition of terrorism was taken, which was Daesh, Al-Qaeda's franchise in Syria. And another step was taken to arm a group to go after them. And I assure you that was not done with a broad contextual analysis and a desire to make a message to another state. It was a very narrow utilitarian step. But we're living with the second and third order effects of that even now. So this is why it's so important that we revisit what is it that we mean when we say terror. Because I don't think it's that simple, with all due respect, that it's any group that's against humanity. Because all of the terrorists are against very specific sets of humanity.
Right. So, I mean, to be honest then, panel, while we can have a conference and we can sit and condemn terrorism and we can say, you know, yes, there should be more regional cooperation, but is the truth not that really we need to all be a little more introspective and ask what role our own governments are playing, and we as citizens of wider societies are willing to put up with policies that may, you know, we may see serve, quote unquote, our national agenda, but are directly or indirectly feeding the problem of terrorism, right? Maybe I could pose that question to Mohammed Musa Bello, Minister, if you want to have a stab at that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really.
And you're dealing with the Boko Haram, obviously,
yes,
issue. And there are allegations that they receive support from, let's say, quarters and entities which are connected with some level of governance.
Now, generally, you know, if you look at the definition from who a terrorist is, it's always going to be difficult to get consensus because one terrorist to you might be something else for somebody else. So the point is to really look at what is the final outcome of terrorism. That is crisis, killings, death, disruption of communities, disruption of livelihoods, and then, creation of humanitarian crisis. And I think if we all get focused as to what is the final outcome of terrorism, then it becomes easier to understand why there is a need to have cooperation. For instance, you talked about Boko Haram. When Boko Haram started about a decade or so ago, they were just a group of young students who tried to revolt, and they were in a small location without arms, without capacity. But now, Boko Haram has become something of a non-state actor, a government within a certain location, even though the government of Nigeria and quite a number of West African countries have been able to tame them. But the reality is, we have to really focus on the outcomes of terrorism to make it easier for us to understand why there needs to be cooperation, irrespective of what the ideological reasons or foundation for that terrorism activism is.
But let's be honest, Minister,
Yeah.
if we define terrorism simply as the outcome
Yeah.
and the killings, the bloodshed, as you well know, it's well documented by human rights organizations to make those same allegations about state actors too, right? That sometimes state actors engage in this. So is there not, maybe coming back to the point where Mr. Saifullah Haji Muftioglu made about the concept of maybe trying to look at things from the perspective of sharing resources, justice. Is that too idealistic? What do you think? Maybe we can pose the question to Professor Murat. Can we say there's look at it, who is willing to share and to look at the world through a narrative of cooperation and who's not? Since it seems a lot of people have blood on their hands, shall we say?
I think, first of all, your perspective is very idealistic. So
Okay.
it's really difficult to reach out this kind of conclusion.
Okay.
Simply because of many reasons, many difficulties regarding the definition of terrorism. I think there are three important domains that we have to look at to understand why we have a lack of common understanding about terrorism. The first one is about the lack of conceptual clarity. So many, under the framework of United Nations, there is 193 countries. And when we look at their conceptions about terrorism, they have all different terrorism definitions. When we look at the inside the state structure, for example, United States, FBI has its own terrorism definition or terrorist definition, or CIA has its own terrorism definitions. There is also lack of a cooperation amongst the states. This is, I think, one of the most important obstacles to define and to make a comprehensive definition about terrorism. Another important things and domain is the lack of clarity amongst the international organizations. When we take into consideration the international and governmental organizations and non-governmental organizations, we see the same problem about the definition. So therefore, it is really difficult to make a common understanding about the terrorism which can be accepted all parties in the international system. So what we have to rethink about the lack of common definition, the cooperation among states and international organizations is the changing dynamics of international terrorism, especially in the context of transnationalism, which is the main characteristic.
Is there a
of
need for
international terrorism.
maybe a new international convention, a UN convention to define what it is? Well,
Yes,
what is
we
the
ha-
framework that's needed for that?
Yes, I think we have a framework, of course. In defining terrorism, we have, for example, definition about violence. We have a common understanding about terrorism in terms of its nature, especially in the context of political objective. Of course, we have also some other criteria about terrorist organization target selection, whether it can be a combated or non-combated target selection. So we are all agree about these kind of component, sub-component of terrorism, but in terms of the practices, unfortunately, we do not have any common practices, common grounds. I think yesterday President Erdogan underlined very important thing about the changing dynamics of transnational or international terrorism by saying that unless everyone is secure, no one is secure. I think this should be a kind of starting point to understand the changing dynamics of international terrorism, to reach a common perspective in defining this very contested concept.
I like the word or the term changing dynamics, and since Rich was gracious enough to let me put him on the spot, I wonder if also Mohammed Hanif Atmar, the Foreign Minister of Afghanistan, won't mind me doing the same a little bit. Talking about changing dynamics and reaching understandings and consensuses which may change, I'm wondering, how does the Afghan government view the Taliban now? Now that there is an agreement between the US and the Taliban, there's peace talks between Taliban and Afghan officials. Are they still considered? Do you still consider them to be a terrorist group? Does the need to deal with them change, or the definition of them change as your need to deal with them changes, for example?
Hello. Does it work?
Hopefully, yes. I think we're good now.
Good. Thank you, Zaidan, and I'm so honored to join the distinguished panelists and also our distinguished participants. Thank you, the government and people of Turkey, and especially the hospitable people of Antalya, for this wonderful forum. Sir, we draw a line between Taliban and the regional and global terrorists. We do not draw a line
On what basis, Minister?
in terms of their nationality, not in terms of their approaches. First of all, we do not lack definition. An important document in this respect, which has been produced as a result of consensus of the United Nations, is the UN counterterrorism strategy, where there is absolutely clearly given a definition, and then the state's responsibilities are defined, and also the key pillars for the counterterrorism are also spelled out. The issue now is for us that we are dealing with three types of terrorists. The ones that come from Afghanistan, the ones that have been fighting over Afghanistan and coming from the region, such as LAT, ATIM, IMU, all of them designated as terrorist organizations by the United Nations. And the third category is related to global terrorists, such as Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Something that we miss here is the symbiotic relationship among these groups. They need each other. While they may be pursuing different goals, political goals, when it comes to their countries of origin, but they are certainly having this symbiotic relationship. A second symbiotic relationship that we often miss is that these terrorist organizations have close relations with transnational organized criminal networks, including drugs, weapons, human trafficking, and the war economy. So in this respect, it's becoming so difficult, notoriously difficult to draw a line. But what is important is that the states must recognize one fact, that selectivity in fighting terrorism is the key reason for our failure. Selectivity in terms of states reducing the problem around the specific element that threatens them. But they don't see the bigger picture, that that element is part of a terrorist ecosystem So the states must honor their obligations.
So there must be a more holistic approach towards
Absolutely.
tackling. Okay.
Absolutely.
But you already said you've had to make a differentiation based on nationality already when you're dealing with different groups, right? I assume that's for politically expedient reasons, because some groups you probably think I can win them over, they can be integrated into the system, and some I can't, right?
The issue is about how do you make peace with the ones who are committed to
Right.
peace, and the ones who are not committed, and you have no legal grounds to make peace with them. Like, for instance, in Afghanistan, the reason we draw that line, we can make peace with the Taliban because they're Afghans, but they have to stop terrorism, they have to stop killing people, and they have to stop cooperating with international terrorists. But we cannot make peace with Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and other terrorist groups who are not Afghans. We have no political reason to work with them. Our only goal is for them to leave our country and to not be fighting over our country in pursuit of their political goals, which may relate to their other objectives. So,
right.
to sum it up, I don't think we have a problem of definition. What we have as a problem is selectivity, state selectivity in fighting terrorism.
All right, talking about state selectivity, I think the call and the message is for a more holistic approach to this problem. Let me pose then the question to Hassoumi Massoudi, the Minister of State and the Foreign Minister of Niger. Obviously, your part of the world, sir, is dealing with the challenge of Boko Haram. And as I'm sure you're aware, I think it was reported yesterday that they now think that the Boko Haram leader is in fact dead. Its strongholds reportedly overrun, remaining fighters have been scattered. But interestingly, not as a result of a clash with any state actor, but because of a clash with what's known as ISWAP, the West African affiliate of ISIS, which is apparently gaining ground at the expense of Boko Haram. When you look at a situation like that, and leading on from what the Foreign Minister of Afghanistan was talking about, how they are parts of a bigger picture and they can change. We've seen a state go after them, Nigeria, and apparently couldn't inflict that level of defeat that ISWAP could. What does that say to you about the level of regional cooperation, the level of approaching this problem more holistically rather than only through the security prison?
Bien, merci. Donc d'abord, je remercie les autorités turques de nous donner l'opportunité de nous exprimer sur ces questions-là. Et je voudrais, avant de répondre directement à votre question, rappeler dans quel contexte nous sommes. Nous sommes au Sahel. Donc il n'y a pas que le Boko Haram, nous en avons deux. Nous avons deux foyers, un avec Boko Haram et un autre à la frontière du Mali, dans le Sahel. Et je vais rappeler juste des faits d'histoire. Comment ça a commencé dans cette zone, dans le Sahel? C'est à partir de l'effondrement de l'État libyen. Après la guerre en Libye, ces groupes ont essaimé dans le Sahel. Ces groupes terroristes qui ont une franchise, qui avaient à l'époque une franchise, leur franchise c'était Al-Qaïda. Ensuite est venu s'ajouter l'État islamique dans cette région, qu'ils appellent l'État islamique au Grand Sahara. Donc voilà d'où c'est parti et d'où ça s'est développé. Ça s'est développé d'abord au Mali dans un contexte de rébellion au nord du Mali, de fragilisation et de marginalisation dans les marges de l'État malien, dans un État en crise. Donc voilà le premier facteur. Ensuite, il y a eu un deuxième mouvement. Le deuxième mouvement est né, lui, de l'effondrement de Daesh en Syrie et en Irak. Cet effondrement les a projetés encore dans notre région, au niveau du Sahel. Donc voilà, ici, la définition que nous avons de ce terrorisme que nous connaissons, il y a un consensus international pour le définir. On l'a vu construire un État en Syrie et en Irak. Donc c'est des groupes non étatiques, fondés sur une idéologie totalitaire, qui ont un projet politique. Le projet, c'est de construire un État totalitaire qui jure avec nos valeurs, avec nos traditions culturelles, parce que nous, chez nous, on est musulmans, mais qui est cette pratique de l'islam, nous ne l'acceptons pas. Donc, ils sont contre la pratique traditionnelle, tolérante et ouverte de l'islam. Donc, c'est ça la définition, cette définition avec ces franchises-là qu'ils utilisent au niveau du Sahel, qu'ils utilisent aussi au niveau du Nigeria. Boko Haram aussi était affilié à Al-Qaïda. Maintenant, ceux qui ont liquidé Boko Haram au Nigeria, c'est la même chose, c'est toujours le projet totalitaire de l'État islamique. C'est pour cela que nous disons que cette définition, en tout cas cet ennemi étant caractérisé au plan mondial, nous l'avons vu agir, nous l'avons vu tenter de construire un État. Le monde entier s'est battu pour les vaincre, mais ils se sont repliés chez nous et nous appelons la communauté internationale à aller jusqu'au bout. Nous sommes sur la ligne de front, ce que j'appelle appeler la ligne de front, de défense des valeurs de l'humanité entière contre ces groupes-là qui sont implantés au Sahel. Et nous pensons que la coopération internationale, le monde entier,
But
il y a un
Minister,
consensus.
why has the international cooperation failed in a way that apparently ISWAP is succeeding? Is it because they're appealing to the mindset of some of the supporters of Boko Haram in a way that states have failed to speak to the hearts and minds?
On n'a pas que Boko Haram, hein. On a Boko Haram au lac Tchad, au Nigeria et au Niger et au Tchad. Ça c'est à 2000 km plus loin, toujours au Niger, au Mali et au Burkina, nous avons l'État islamique au Grand Sahel et nous avons Al-Qaïda. Nous avons les deux. Donc deux foyers dans la zone. En ce qui concerne Boko Haram, effectivement, le groupe d'État islamique l'a vaincu, a liquidé, a pris le dessus, mais c'est le même projet. Au niveau régional, nous avons une coopération avec le Nigeria, le Cameroun, le Tchad et le Niger, et nous arrivons à le contenir. Nous ne sommes pas encore arrivés à l'écraser, mais aujourd'hui, c'est un foyer moins important que le foyer qu'il y a entre le Mali, le Niger et le Burkina. Et ce foyer-là est alimenté par les successions de défaites qu'ils ont subies en Syrie, en Irak, et l'éclatement de l'État en Libye. Donc voilà un peu le contexte, et je pense que cette définition-là, il ne faut pas les réduire simplement à des groupes étatiques, à non étatiques armés, mais ils ont un projet, c'est un projet totalitaire, et il faut que l'ensemble du monde entier combatte ce terrorisme-là, qui a une franchise et qui a un projet, un vrai projet contre nos valeurs. Donc voilà ce que je peux dire par rapport à la définition, et une définition acceptée par les faits.
All right. We're going to open up the floor for questions soon. Maybe to kick things off, let me invite, I believe we have the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Congo, Adubanjo Awetho. If you're here, sir, why don't we get a microphone? Beg your pardon. It's been told from the Congo Republic. So, could we get a microphone for the gentleman? Where is our microphone ushers? Nerede mikrofonlar? Burada mümkün mü? Lütfen. Okay, I think there's another one on the way. You can keep your microphones. Burada mümkün.
Merci pour la parole. Moi, je suis le vice-ministre des Affaires étrangères de la République démocratique du Congo. Ce panel nous intéresse tant, d'autant plus que ça ne fait pas plus longtemps que la communauté internationale vient de qualifier les ADF NALU comme des terroristes. À l'est de la République démocratique du Congo, si nous prenons la montagne Rwenzori, en passant par Butembo, Beni, Owicha, aujourd'hui ils prennent même la partie de la province de l'Ituri. Ces ADF NALU est un groupe armé qui menaçait la République ougandaise à un certain temps. Avec la force militaire de la République ougandaise, ils se sont déversés dans la forêt de la province, disons, de la République démocratique du Congo, plus précisément en province du Nord Kivu. Mais avec leurs modes opératoires, et actuellement, ils se font des alliés avec les groupes armés locaux, et ils tuent, ils puent, ils enlèvent même les organes sensibles et les organes étimes. Pour en faire quoi, nous ne savons pas. La définition, comme venait de dire notre homologue, il faut qu'on essaye de voir cette définition d'une façon multidimensionnelle. La définition de terroriste réduit sensiblement, ça les protège et ça les épargne à des cibles de la communauté internationale. C'est ainsi que quand une fois la communauté internationale donne une définition, qualifie un groupe terroriste, il faut qu'on ne se limite pas à une définition réduite qui les épargne, plutôt une définition multidimensionnelle, et aussi définir les moyens, les voies et moyens par lesquels ils peuvent aussi accompagner les pays, je dirais les pays victimes, à les neutraliser automatiquement. Mais on se rendra compte qu'on peut bien donner une définition suite à un groupe terroriste, mais on n'arrive pas à donner les moyens conséquents pour permettre à ce que les pays victimes puissent faire face à ces groupes terroristes. Raison pour laquelle actuellement nous avons l'état de siège vers l'est de la République démocratique du Congo. C'est pour éradiquer définitivement ces groupes armés, et nous en appelons à la communauté internationale ainsi qu'aux pays limitrophes, aux pays voisins, de faire de leur mieux pour qu'on arrive à mettre un terme à ces exactions. Merci.
Okay, so there is a need, obviously, for a more inclusive approach and a holistic perspective of what constitutes terrorism and the activities they're engaging in. Maybe it's time also to raise the issue of the new technologies and unconventional methods. We're not just talking about, thanks, by the way, to the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of Congo for pointing out the sort of different forms and shapes of the activities of terrorists. But they're also using drones, paramotors, all kinds of new technology. I'm wondering if Professor Morad Yashiltash would like to perhaps shed some light on what kind of challenge that poses now.
I think the transformation of the international terrorism is really important. That is posing a real challenge for state in their counter-terrorism policies and strategies. The technological aspect of international terrorism is the new manifestation of this transformation, in which the rising drone capacity of terrorist organization is one of the important characteristic feature of this new transformation. But before I move on to these kind of increasing technological capacities of terrorist organizations and other non-state armed organizations, we have to also underline the innovative aspect of terrorism. Yes, we have an important subject here that we are going to discuss about the innovative nature of diplomacy, but international terrorism or domestic or regional terrorism have also innovative, aspects. So we have to know that terrorist organizations are rational actors. They are not irrational. Terrorists are rational actors also. They are intentionally using different tactics to achieve their strategic objectives. So therefore they are, they can able to adapt themselves into the new,
to the changing circumstances.
Yes, changing circumstances. So the technology, I think, is one of the important opportunities for terrorist organization to achieve their strategic objectives. So drone, I think, is really important. For counterterrorism strategies, drone-ification of terrorism policies became an important tool for countries, but at the same time, terrorist organizations start to
adopt it as well. Right.
This drone technology to target their objective on the ground. So one thing that I would like to also emphasize is that the international community, international organizations or other countries which have been extensively using drone technology is also important in countering terrorist organization. Why? Because there are two important dynamics in dronification of counter-terrorism strategy. International society and international actors should really consider using drone technology in targeting terrorist organizations in terms of legal aspects in using drone. We have many textbook examples, US drone strike and targeted killing in Afghanistan, in Yemen and Iraq. So as an international community, I think this should be reconsidered in targeting the terrorist organizations. The second one about the how the terrorist organization using this capacity. For example, I would like to give a striking example from PKK. PKK has so-called drone academy, where in Iraq, where exactly is near the Mahmur camp, which is called and listed as refugee camp United Nations. So this is also problematic. So we have to reconsider all these kind of drone technology.
Interesting. Let me give the floor a chance if anyone has a question. Okay, there's a lady over there. Can we get a microphone, please? The lady in red. If we have time, we'll come to you as well afterwards. Go ahead. Please start with your affiliation and to whom your question is addressed. Please keep it brief, and we'll try and keep the answer brief as well.
Thank you. This is Maria Shebnemurj with the Daily Sabah, and this is a very good topic. And who is terrorist and who is not? I mean, the answer, the one who will give the answer to this question will get the bigger prize. But there is a bigger problem, I guess, because recently, more and more every day, terror and human rights issues are intertwining. I mean, someone's terrorist is the other's human rights advocate. With regards to PKK, for instance, maybe Murat Yeşiltaş can explain this. We talk about PKK for more than 40 years, and they killed maybe more than 40,000 Turkish people. But when you look at Europe or some Western countries, they say that, oh, there are human rights problems in Turkey. With regards to the Gülenists who attempted the coup in 2016, 5 years ago, they killed 251 people just one night. And people now talk about whether the Gülenists are the terrorists or not. They are still talking about it. When you ask Turkish people, 99% of Turkish society will say that yes, they are the ones behind the coup. I mean, briefly, tell me, terror is simply fear. Terror means fear. And I think before start to talk about terrorism, let's not forget the meaning of terror and tell me.
Okay.
Tell me who is terrorist and who is human rights defender, who is human rights advocate. And please tell me, is human rights the new geopolitics? Is human rights the new geostrategy? Thank you.
Okay. Who wants to have a go at that one? Maybe go ahead, Foreign Minister of Afghanistan. A brief answer on that, and we'll try and squeeze one in if we can.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I mean, there are two issues I wanted to talk about. First, the transformation of the terrorist capabilities and use of new technologies will have to be studied in two aspects. One is what the professor referred to, use of new technology for scaling up violence, pursuit of violent means. Second is also the use of new technology for expansion and financing of terrorist networks. So we need to be aware of this. This is important for state response, especially when the virtual world is used for indoctrination and radicalization. This is a key issue for any state that will have to be concerned about. Second, in terms of who is terrorist and who is not, from whose perspective. I mean, simply we've agreed as a humanity, as United Nations, as this new global governance system, there is a law. There's a law for human rights, and there is a law of war and international humanitarian law. No cause, no objective, nothing of the sort would justify use of terrorist means to kill people.
Killing of innocent civilians in order for a
Absolutely.
political end.
You may have a legitimate cause, but you need to pursue that legitimately. You cannot continue to kill innocent people or violate international humanitarian
Here's where it
law.
gets difficult, though, Foreign Minister, is that we are seeing some state actors now themselves, as nationalism rises, overlooking, shall we say, human rights. When you have camps of people which are in the middle of no man's land and nobody wants to repatriate them because they are former terrorist fighters or families and no one knows what to do with them, or some governments are even stripping them of their citizenship rather than figuring out, bring them to justice if they've done something wrong, or reintegrate them or do something. Is that not an example of how states are also sometimes, slipping their standards on human rights? Rich, I think you want to get onto that.
I just
which
wanted-
feeds the whole terrorism cycle.
I think this is an important part of the equation, exactly. And to tie it back to the question over here, I think in every terror campaign we look at, there's at least three determinants. One is, and we identified this early, that some state in the region wants to cause trouble or has a problem. The other is that there's an entrepreneur, if you want to call it that, somebody who's going to take
Right.
that to make money or to get political power because there's an opportunity. But the third is failures of governance. And this goes to human rights as well, because there has to be a pool of dissatisfaction. There has to be something that makes people say, or keeps people from saying, of course I won't support that because I support my state.
Because
So-
they see no other opportunity. in
That's
life.
right. So this is the one place where we can all cooperate on is improving governance in all of our societies, because the United States is not exempt from this either. When you have people who feel that their democratic processes don't allow for dissent and don't allow for human rights, then they are tempted by these other two factors, by the entrepreneurs of violence and by the states who might benefit from pursuing it.
All right, wonderful. Can we squeeze in? Where is my point man, Ege? Okay, if you promise, the lady here, can you promise to make it a very short question, and we'll try and make it a very short answer. Can we quickly get a microphone to the lady here in the front row? Okay. Very brief, please, madam.
Teşekkür ederim. Kapadokya Üniversitesi'nden geliyorum. Geleceğim Maraş'ta. O halde hemen kısa sorayım. Sorum çok açık aslında. Oturumun başında terör örgütlerine devlet desteğinden bahsettiniz Sayın Seyfullah Bey. Sorum çok açık Sayın Reich ve açık bir cevap istiyorum. Neden NATO üyesi ve Amerika müttefiki Türkiye'ye Amerika neden PKK'ya destek veriyor? Teşekkür ederim.
Net bir soru.
Okay, I think we've kind of already gone over that one, but very briefly, Rich, I think it's not a secret that was probably aimed at you.
I'll take the question. It's a fair question, and I'll give you the two elements of the answer very briefly because I know we're about to finish. The first is, in the formal sense, the United States still lists the PKK as a foreign terrorist organization, still prosecutes PKK crimes where we can find them in the international financial system, still supports Turkey 100% at the political level in its fight against PKK terrorism. The problem is that we have made a conceptual distinction between the YPG, which Turkey sees with some justification in my view, personally, as an extension and affiliate of the PKK. But because the United States has made that distinction operationally for raison d'etat in Syria, it does not believe as a state or as a policy community that it is supporting the PKK. Now, I don't think it's a sustainable policy over the long term because there is a contradiction there. So at the root of your question, I think you're onto something. You're onto a deep contradiction in our support to Turkey and its very important fight against the PKK and this thing that we've done in Syria. And I think that will be resolved before too long because it's not a policy fundamental for the United States. It was a tactical and a utilitarian step. The fundamental pillar of our commitment in NATO, as you've pointed out, is to Turkish security, and over time that çelişki, that contradiction will be resolved.
All right. I think this has been actually, I'm very sorry we are out of time, but I'm glad to see that there still are so many hands up. I think we can button this up by saying it was a really good discussion. We may not have solved the problems of the world and terrorism, but I like the distinction that Rich made in the end, or the focus, that maybe we're saying there are three areas that we need to focus on. The role of state support, the opportunistic element or opportunist entrepreneurial element, and governance and human rights. It's been a wonderful discussion. How about we give the panel here a great hand of applause for that? Thank you for listening. I believe there's another panel to follow shortly, so we'll see you guys here again very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.